What's up, Headliner Nation? This is it, week 18, the final rankings video of the season. And if you're watching this right now, you've already been in the trenches with us all year long. And maybe you've won a championship already, and maybe your season was wrecked. I don't know, but the week 18 chaos is finally here. Shoot, I'm here in a hotel room in Tampa trying to go cheer my Panthers on to win and get in the playoffs. But for today, we got some work to do. Let's get into the rankings. What's up, Headliner Nation? My name is Brad, the Rankings King, and before we dive into this week's rankings, just a reminder that these are the consensus rankings between Jake and Kyle and the Headliners team. And for more detailed analysis, make sure to check out the start-sit videos already posted from Kyle this week. And if you want even more breakdowns each week, make sure to join the Fantasy Headliners community. Stay in touch throughout the year, and make sure to join that community by hitting the join button below. That's going to get you access to extra rankings like flex, kicker, defense, and a spot inside of our Discord. All right, we're going to make this short and sweet today. We're going to jump right into the rankings, no hits or misses, because, hey, it's the last week, and we're going to do our quick and dirty top 30 at the running back position. And we start in Tier 1. We've got Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Derrick Henry, Jahmyr Gibbs, James Cook, Devon Achane, Travis Etienne Jr., and Chase Brown. At number 1, we start with Christian McCaffrey, and with one game to go, Christian McCaffrey has yet another 2,000-yard season under his belt. It's going to be another tough matchup against Seattle, but this game is for the division and the number 1 seed in the NFC, so there is a lot on the line. At number 2, we've got Bijan Robinson, and after his Week 17 explosion, he now has over 2,200 yards on the season. He's had at least 165 total yards in 4 of his last 5 games, and now he gets a Saints defense that allows almost 20 points to running backs. At number 3, we've got Derrick Henry, and Henry won fantasy championships in Week 17, and he'll have a shot to do it again this week. He's had over 100 yards in 6 of his last 7, and now he faces Pittsburgh, who has shut down the run lately. At number 4, we've got Jahmyr Gibbs, and Gibbs got us to the playoffs and abandoned us when we needed him the most. He hasn't had 70 yards in a game in 3 weeks, but Dan Campbell will want to finish strong, and this is a great matchup against Chicago. At number 6, we have Devon Achane, and Achane has a chance to score 10-plus points in all 17 games this season. Unfortunately, he's on the road in New England and against a defense that is playing for the number 1 seed in the AFC. He did have 122 yards and a touchdown against them, though, in Week 2. At number 7, we've got Travis Etienne Jr., and the Jags are fighting for the division, and Etienne should get plenty of touches. He's had at least 90 yards or a touchdown in 7 of his last 8, and it's worth noting, though, that his worst game against this Titans defense was just a couple of weeks ago. At number 8, we've got Chase Brown, and after all of that concern, after the second month of the season, Brown has absolutely exploded. He's currently the RB10 on the year, and now he gets a Cleveland defense that has allowed 130 plus rushing yards in 4 straight games. All right, that's it for Tier 1. Now, before we head into the next tier, I want to make sure that you're all set up on Underdog. You already know that we've crushed those player pick'ems on Underdog this year, and this is the last week, and so what are you waiting for? Head over to Underdog Fantasy or download the app and create a new account using the referral code HEADLINERS when you do so. Then just make your initial deposit and come join a contest. If you sign up with that promo code, again, it's HEADLINERS, you're going to be able to get access to all of the promos that Underdog offers weekly. And check this out, when you play your first $5, you're going to get an extra $75 in bonus funds. So you play 5, you get 75. It's that easy. And don't forget, Jake is always going to be breaking down the best picks weekly in our show on Fridays. Links to join are in the description, and we look forward to playing with you this week. All right, let's turn the page to Tier 2. We've got Jonathan Taylor, Kyron Williams, RJ Harvey, Breece Hall, Malik Davis, Travion Henderson, and Bucky Irving. At number 9, we've got Jonathan Taylor, and we've seen the yardage decrease with Phillip Rivers, but the touchdowns have still been there. He scored in 3 of his last 4 games, and now he has Riley Leonard at quarterback in a tough matchup against Houston, who will be trying to win this game. At number 10, we've got Kyron Williams, and he's likely to play less than a full game. McVay is playing games and saying that his starters will start, but don't be surprised if they play less than a full game. Corum did get banged up, though, last week, so there's some hope here. At number 11, we've got RJ Harvey in a Denver win, and they lock up the number 1 seed in the AFC. Harvey's had touchdowns in 5 straight games, and he's facing a tough Charger defense here. However, the Chargers have already come out and said that they're going to be resting some of their starters. At number 12, we have Breece Hall, and for as often as the Jets are losing, Breece continues to look solid at running the football. Now he gets the Bills, who allow the 6th most points to running backs and will more than likely be resting some of their starters as well. At number 13, we've got Malik Davis, and with the injury to Javonte Williams, there's no reason to run him out in a meaningless game. That means that Davis should get plenty of volume against a Giants defense that allows 23 points to running backs. At number 14, we've got Travion Henderson, and New England needs a win and Denver to lose to clinch the number 1 seed. Henderson just isn't seeing the pass-catching work that Stevenson is, but Miami allowing the 12th most points to running backs, Hendo has a chance at a touchdown this week. At number 15, we have Bucky Irving, and the late season collapse of the Bucs has also led to a tough road for Bucky. He hasn't scored a touchdown in 3 weeks, and now he gets a home game in a must-win situation for the division and playoffs against Carolina. All right, that's it for Tier 2. Now let's turn the page to Tier 3. We have Aaron Jones, Tank Bigsby, DeAndre Swift, Ashton Jeanty, Jalen Warren, Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard, Kenneth Gainwell, and Zach Charbonnet. At number 16, we've got Aaron Jones, and there's nothing great about the Minnesota offense, but Jones has had 20-plus touches in back-to-back games and now faces his former Green Bay team where they'll be resting starters or missing players due to injury. At number 17, we have Tank Bigsby, and with the starters being rested, we should be in line for more volume going to Tank. Shipley will be involved too, but this is a great matchup against Washington. At number 18, we've got DeAndre Swift, and he's likely to sit but not formally announced yet. And if he does play, though, he'll get a Detroit defense that has allowed 150-plus rushing yards in 3 straight games. At number 19, we have Ashton Jeanty, and we still have 1 game left of boom or bust Ashton Jeanty. Hopefully 2026 is going to be different, but this week he'll have a backup quarterback in Kenny Pickett in a matchup against a banged-up Chiefs defense that's just trying to get through the rest of the season. At number 20, we have Jalen Warren, and with no DK Metcalf, the Steelers will once again be relying on their run game to try and win the division. But this Baltimore defense has allowed less than 100 yards rushing in 4 of the last 6 games, so this will not be an easy one. At number 21, we've got Ramondre Stevenson, and with a near 50-50 split alongside Henderson, it's safe to say that Stevenson will once again have a role in Week 18 against Miami in a game that the Patriots really want to win. Stevenson has been slightly safer in PPR formats, though. At number 22, we've got Tony Pollard, and in what seems like a down year for Pollard, he's still sitting at 1,200 total yards. He's only 77 yards away from his 3rd straight 1,300-yard season, but he'll have to do it against a difficult Jags run defense. At number 23, we have Kenneth Gainwell, and Gainwell saw his touches decrease in Week 17, but in a must-win game against Baltimore with no DK or Darnell Washington, expect him to be more involved in the pass game once again this week. At number 24, we've got Zach Charbonnet, and he may not be getting the most volume in the backfield, but he's getting all of the touchdown work and opportunity. He now has 5 touchdowns over his last 6 games and has scored a touchdown in 9 games this season, including Week 1 against this San Francisco defense. All right, that's it for Tier 3. Now let's turn the page to Tier 4. We've got Woody Marks, Rico Dowdle, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, Tyrone Tracy, Kenneth Walker III, Kyle Monangai, and Audrey Estime. At number 25, we've got Woody Marks, and with Houston fighting for the division and Indy having nothing to play for, Marks could once again see close to 20 touches. It's a total that he's had in 3 of his last 4 games, and a late Houston lead could lead to a lot more running. At number 26, we've got Rico Dowdle, and Rico hasn't gone over 80 total yards in a game in 5 weeks. This may be a must-win game, but with his recent lack of success, it's hard to rank him inside of the top 24. At number 27, we've got Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, and at this point, why even throw a questionable Chris Rodriguez out there? Give the rookie back another game against the Philadelphia defense that allows over 20 points to the running back position. At number 28, we've got Tyrone Tracy, and Tracy has had 15-plus touches in 6 of his last 7 games, and now he gets a matchup against Dallas, who allows the 8th most points to running backs. At number 29, we've got Kenneth Walker III, and Walker went back to his disappointing ways in Week 17 as Charbonnet once again scored 2 touchdowns. Walker may be getting great volume, but Charbonnet is getting the more beneficial touches. At number 30, we've got Kyle Monangai, and Monangai is interesting because if Chicago does decide to rest some of its starters, how does he fit into that equation? I wouldn't be surprised if he saw decent volume against Detroit, who has struggled against the run lately. And at number 31, we've got Aldrich Estime. And I know he had a great game last week, but 9 of his last 16 points came off of one play, and he isn't known for being a big play type of a running back. But he may see around 15 touches against this average Falcons defense. All right, so that's it for your top 31 running backs in tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we've got a couple of guys on the outside looking in with Blake Corum. He's likely to play less than a full game. Emmanuel Wilson, Ray Davis, David Montgomery, Michael Carter, and Dylan Sampson. All right, that's it for running backs. Now let's move it on to quarterbacks, and we start in tier 1, and we've got Drake May, Trevor Lawrence, Dak Prescott, and Brock Purdy. Topping the list at number 1, we've got Drake May, and the Patriots clinched the number 1 seed in the AFC with a win and a Bronco loss, but both teams play at the same time on Sunday, so expect them to start their starters and try to win this game against Miami, who allows almost 19 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. At number 2, we've got Trevor Lawrence, and over the last 6 weeks, Trevor Lawrence is the highest scoring quarterback in fantasy, averaging over 26 points per game. A win clinches the division, and Tennessee allows over 19 fantasy points to quarterbacks. At number 3, we've got Dak Prescott, and Dak has scored at least 19 points in 5 of his last 6, but may be without Jake Ferguson and Javonte Williams in this matchup against the Giants. Look for him to try and throw it all over a Giants team that allows the 7th most points to quarterbacks. At number 4, we've got Brock Purdy, and Purdy has been winning people fantasy titles for weeks. Now they face off against Seattle for the number 1 seed in the NFC, and this isn't an easy matchup against Seattle, but they'll be playing at home, and he could have George Kittle back. All right, that's it for Tier 1. Now let's move it on to Tier 2. We've got Jackson Dart, Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson, Bo Nix, Matthew Stafford, Josh Allen, Caleb Williams, Jacoby Brissett, and Jared Goff. At number 5, we've got Jackson Dart, and Dart's rushing upside in a matchup against the Cowboys, who allow the most points to quarterbacks, is enough to keep them as a Verge top 10 option this week. At number 6, we've got Joe Burrow, and the Bengals haven't had much to play for in weeks, but Burrow has 10 passing touchdowns over his last 4 games. Cleveland has been much easier to run on than throw on as of late, and that's why Burrow isn't any higher here. At number 7, we've got Lamar Jackson, and he's currently questionable to play, but they have already come out and said that they expect him to play in a must-win game for a playoff berth against a division rival. At number 8, we've got Bo Nix, and a win against the Chargers would lock up the number 1 seed for the Broncos. With the Chargers already saying that starters will be rested, Nix should have a shot at a solid game against a tough opponent. At number 9, we've got Matthew Stafford, and here's the thing here, he's likely to play less than a full game. McVay has come out and said that the starters will start, but that can be deceiving. Just because they start doesn't mean that they finish. At number 10, we've got Josh Allen, and that's the case here. He is likely to sit, but not formally announced yet. We have to think that they let him rest his foot injury. At number 11, we've got Caleb Williams, and he could potentially sit as well, but with all the injuries on the offensive side of the football, I wouldn't be surprised if the Bears rest up Week 18 to try and be as healthy as possible for the playoffs, but there is that chance that he plays a little bit. At number 12, we've got Jacoby Brissett, and with the likelihood of the Rams not playing their starters a full game, there's a chance that Brissett puts up a solid day. 4 weeks ago against the Rams, he threw for 271 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he could be in that neighborhood again. At number 13, we've got Jared Goff, and with Amon-Ra banged up, there's a chance that he doesn't play this week. But I can't see Dan Campbell rolling over on the road in Chicago. With Chicago more than likely resting starters, Goff could still put up an above-average day. All right, that's it for Tier 2. Now let's move it on to Tier 3. We've got Sam Darnold, CJ Stroud, Baker Mayfield, Tyler Shuck, Cam Ward, Bryce Young, and Kirk Cousins. At number 14, we've got Sam Darnold, and Seattle continues to win, but Darnold continues to be inconsistent. Over his last 7 games, 3 of them have resulted in 0 touchdowns. The number 1 seed and the division are on the line here, though, and San Fran hasn't been able to stop the pass. At number 15, we've got CJ Stroud, and Stroud continues to be inconsistent, but they still need to win this game to win the division, and they play at the same time as Jacksonville, so they'll be playing to win. At number 16, we have Baker Mayfield, and Tampa is in a must-win matchup to clinch the division and a playoff spot. This team has lost 7 of its last 8 games, and Baker has struggled against this Carolina team just 2 weeks ago. In a home game with everything on the line, expect him to air it out. At number 17, we have Tyler Shuck, and who would have thought that Shuck would be one of the leading candidates for Offensive Rookie of the Year? He's had at least 17 points in 5 straight games, and now he gets a hit-or-miss Atlanta defense. At number 18, we have Cam Ward, and Cam has now thrown multiple touchdown passes in 4 straight games, and you have to think that Tennessee would love to keep Jacksonville from winning that division, plus it's much easier to throw on the Jags. At number 19, we have Bryce Young, and Bryce was horrendous last week, throwing for only 54 yards. Now he faces off against a Tampa defense that he threw 2 touchdowns against 2 weeks ago, and a win clinches the division and a playoff spot. At number 20, we've got Kirk Cousins, and Cousins has failed to throw for over 200 yards in 3 of his last 4 starts, but he does have 7 touchdowns over the last 3 games. The Saints are easier to run on, so expect a lot of Bijan once again. All right, so there's your quarterbacks, your top 20 in tiers 1, 2, and 3. We've got a couple of guys on the outside looking in. The first is Aaron Rodgers, and Rodgers on Sunday Night Football in a game for the division against the division rival Ravens sounds great, but he'll once again be without DK Metcalf and Darnell Washington, and Rodgers has only thrown multiple touchdowns 1 time since Halloween. And then think about Josh Johnson. With Mariota highly questionable to play, we could be looking at another Josh Johnson start against an Eagles team that could be resting their starters. And then also on the outside looking in, we've got Quinn Ewers. All right, so there's your quarterbacks. Now let's move it on to tight ends. All right, so we'll start in tier 1, and we've got Trey McBride, George Kittle, Hunter Henry, Dalton Schultz, and Kyle Pitts. Topping the list, as always, we've got Trey McBride, and the number 1 tight end on this season who hasn't seen less than 8 targets in a game since week 5. Why not end the year on a bang against a team that could rest its starters in the second half? At number 2, we've got George Kittle, and he's currently questionable to play, but all signs are pointing to him playing with the division and number 1 seed on the line. They need him out there against Seattle, who struggles most against the tight end position. At number 3, we have Hunter Henry, and New England is playing for the number 1 seed, and so they need to win this game, and Hunter Henry is only 5 catches away from a $250,000 incentive bonus. Henry has had at least 70 yards or a touchdown in every game this season in which he's had 5 catches. At number 4, we've got Dalton Schultz, and Houston is still fighting for the division, and Schultz has been one of the most consistent tight ends the second half of the season, and the Colts allow the 8th most fantasy points to the tight end position. At number 5, we have Kyle Pitts, and after a massive December hot streak, Week 17 was a total crash and burn for Pitts. Now he'll look to end the season strong against a Saints defense that held him in check the week of Thanksgiving. All right, that's it for Tier 1. Let's move it on to Tier 2. We've got Jawan Johnson, Brenton Strange, Colson Loveland, and Pat Freiermuth. At number 6, we've got Jawan Johnson, and Johnson has now had back-to-back games with at least 85 yards receiving. He's also had a catch of 30 or more yards in back-to-back games as well, and Chris Olave was also ruled out already, so that helps boost his targets as well. At number 7, we have Brenton Strange, and with all the pass-catching options in Jacksonville, it's hard for Strange to rack up yardage. He's only scored 2 touchdowns all season, but one of them came against this Titans defense 5 weeks ago. At number 8, we have Colson Loveland, and a lot of this has to do with whether or not Chicago rests the majority of their starters. There's a chance that Caleb doesn't start and Loveland doesn't play a full game, so there's a lot of risk here. At number 9, we've got Pat Freiermuth, and no DK and no Washington could mean a lot more Pat Freiermuth. Jonnu has been a short check down option, while Patty F has been utilized down the field. They'll need him against a tough Baltimore defense with the division on the line. All right, that's it for Tier 2. Now let's turn the page to Tier 3. We've got A.J. Barner, Mark Andrews, Tyler Warren, Travis Swift, Kelsey, Michael Meyer, and Chiga Okonkwo. At number 10, we've got A.J. Barner, and Barner now has touchdowns in back-to-back games, and in a heavyweight battle against San Fran, he'll need to be utilized once again since they allow the 7th most points to tight ends. At number 11, we have Mark Andrews, and the last game of the regular season comes down to a matchup for the division between Baltimore and Pittsburgh. Andrews has struggled for most of the season, but the Steelers allow the 2nd most points to tight ends. At number 12, we have Tyler Warren, and it's already been confirmed that Riley Leonard will be the starting quarterback for the Colts this week, and that's not great news for Tyler Warren owners because his worst game of the season came in Leonard's only start. At number 13, we've got Travis Swift Kelsey, and guys, we could be watching the last game in the career of Travis Kelsey, and if so, the road game against the Raiders, who allow the 4th fewest fantasy points to tight ends, and he has a backup quarterback, which is not ideal. At number 14, we have Michael Mayer, and Geno Smith may be out with a high ankle sprain, which means that we're reliant on Kenny Pickett delivering catchable balls to Mayer. He did have 10 targets last week, though, and it's not like the team is full of pass-catching weapons. At number 15, we have Chig Okonkwo, and he's now had 5+ targets in 4 of his last 5 games and touchdowns in back-to-back weeks. Tennessee should fall behind early to Jacksonville, forcing them to throw for the entire game as well. All right, so there's your tight ends in your top 15, tiers 1, 2, and 3. We've got a couple of guys on the outside looking in, and that's Jake Tonjes, Mike Gesicki, Colby Parkinson, Darren Waller, Aronde Gadsden, and Jake Ferguson. All right, now let's move it on to wide receiver rankings, and I've got your top 36 here, and we'll start in tier 1. We've got Jackson Smith-Njigba, CeeDee Lamb, Puka Nacua, Jamar Chase, George Pickens, and Nico Collins. All right, topping the list at number 1, we've got Jackson Smith-Njigba, and JSN is sitting at 1,709 yards, and if he can get 101 in Week 18, he'll have the 6th highest yardage total ever in a season, passing Justin Jefferson from 2022. Now they play San Fran, who had 124 yards against in Week 1. At number 2, we've got CeeDee Lamb, and there's nothing on the line here, but they always want to beat a divisional opponent. With injuries to Jake Ferguson and Javonte Williams, Lamb has a great matchup against a Giants defense that allows the 8th most points to wide receivers. At number 3, we have Puka Nacua, and he's likely to play less than a full game. And sure, McVay has said that the starters would start, but it would be shocking if they played all 4 quarters. I just don't see how you don't have the number 1 overall wide receiver in fantasy not atop the rankings, though, on the last week. At number 4, we have Jamar Chase, and Chase was shut down by the Browns defense back in Week 1, but he's now had at least 100 yards or a touchdown in 4 of his last 5. He's still one of the more difficult matchups in football this week. At number 5, we've got George Pickens, and similar to CeeDee Lamb, Pickens has a great opportunity to end the season strong against a weak Giants defense. And at number 6, we've got Nico Collins, and the volume that Nico gets is just weird. In 3 of his last 6 games, he's failed to get more than 4 targets. He may not have to worry about Sauce Gardner, who is questionable to play, which only betters his chances against a weak Indy defense. All right, that's it for Tier 1. Now let's move it on to Tier 2. We've got Jameson Williams, Mike Evans, Michael Wilson, Zay Flowers, Cortland Sutton, Drake London, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jacoby Myers, Ted McMillan, and T. Higgins. At number 7, we have Jameson Williams, and with Amon-Ra St. Brown dealing with a knee injury, there's a chance that he's limited and more targets go the way of Williams. That will be great against a Bears defense that allows the 3rd most points to wide receivers and will likely be resting some of their starters. At number 8, we've got Mike Evans, and Evans went from commanding targets in a crowded wide receiver room to fighting for targets alongside Godwin, McMillan, and Egbuka. He does have touchdowns and back-to-back games, though, and this game is as must-win as it gets. At number 9, we've got Michael Wilson, and I don't ever root for a player to get injured, but with Marvin Harrison getting hurt once again in Week 17, that should open the door for 10-plus targets going the way of Michael Wilson. At number 10, we've got Zay Flowers, and no Lamar lately, no problem for Zay Flowers. He's had touchdowns now in 3 straight games and potentially gets Lamar back this week in a must-win game for the playoffs against the Steelers, who he had 126 yards against just 4 weeks ago. At number 11, we have Cortland Sutton, and a typical tough defensive matchup against the Chargers may be slightly easier with them resting some starters. Plus, Denver is still playing for the number 1 seed, and Sutton has seen 10-plus targets in 4 straight games. At number 12, we've got Drake London, and I mean, how awesome were the 2 targets, 1 catch and 4 yards that he had in Week 17 against the Rams? I mean, gosh, given the fact he's only had 31 total yards over his last 2 games, causes some concerns, and that's why we have him a little bit lower in the rankings. At number 13, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's questionable to play, and it's still unknown, but he is practicing. And if he does play, you have to expect that he's limited and he doesn't see a full set of snaps. There's no reason in risking further injury in a game that has little meaning for the Lions. At number 14, we've got Jacoby Myers, and after a hot late November, early December, he really hasn't done much the last 2 weeks. The targets, though, they're still there, and so that's promising in a must-win matchup against Tennessee, who allows the 7th most fantasy points to wide receivers. At number 15, we have Ted McMillan, and the inconsistencies continue. He's had 10-plus points in 4 of his last 6, but the 2 games in which he didn't, he failed to even get 30 yards. This is a must-win game, though, and he did score against Tampa 2 weeks ago. At number 16, we have T. Higgins, and it's all about the touchdowns for T. Higgins. He actually only has one 100-yard game all season. However, he does have a touchdown in 6 of his last 8. Now he'll get one of the tougher matchups against Cleveland. All right, that's it for Tier 2. Now let's move it on to Tier 3. We have Wan'Dale Robinson, Juwan Jennings, Parker Washington, Stephon Diggs, Terry McLaurin, Justin Jefferson, Luther Burden, and Jalen Waddle. At number 17, we have Wan'Dale Robinson, and we saw Wan'Dale secure his first ever 1,000-yard season last week. He had a crazy 14 targets in that game and should see similar usage against Dallas, who allows the most points to opposing wide receivers. At number 18, we have Juwan Jennings, and Jennings was heading for a disaster outing in Week 17, but caught a late 38-yard touchdown to extend his touchdown streak to 5 games. It's still unclear whether or not Kittle returns, but he should see at least 5 targets this week against Seattle in a game for the number 1 seed. At number 19, we have Parker Washington, and Washington has now had back-to-back 10-target, 100-yard games. He's been the clear number 1 target for Trevor Lawrence, and now he gets a Titans defense that allows the 7th most points to wide receivers. At number 20, we've got Stephon Diggs, and Diggs may be in some trouble off of the field, but unless more news comes out before this game, he should be out there. New England still wants that number 1 seed in Miami, and they have an average pass defense. At number 21, we have Terry McLaurin, and with the quarterback carousel in Washington, Terry hasn't been able to have any consistency. He's incredibly touchdown, boom, or bust, and even in a matchup against Philly when they may be resting their starters. At number 22, we've got Justin Jefferson, and Jefferson needs just 53 yards receiving to extend his 1,000-yard streak. As simple as that sounds for him to hit, though, it's a total he's only hit 1 time in his last 6 games. It's been a rough year for Justin Jefferson. At least he'll get a matchup against Green Bay, who should be resting some of their starters. At number 23, we have Luther Burden, and back at practice, and he's fully healthy, but still a chance he plays less than a full game, being that this game doesn't really hold a ton of weight for the Bears. At number 24, we have Jalen Waddle, and Waddle got banged up in Week 17, but doesn't currently show on the team's injury report. They don't have much to play for, but chances are they'll be trailing the Patriots and having to throw the ball the entire game. All right, that's it for Tier 3. Now let's turn the page to Tier 4. We've got Chris Godwin, Deebo Samuel, Ricky Pearsall, Brian Thomas Jr., DJ Moore, Troy Franklin, Jalen McMillan, Cooper Kupp, Christian Kirk, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Darius Slayton, and Chimere Dike. At number 25, we have Chris Godwin, and if not for a big 59-yard catch, he wouldn't have done much in Week 17, and now he enters this must-win game for the division and a playoff berth against a Carolina team that he had just 30 yards against 2 weeks ago. At number 26, we have Deebo Samuel, and it looks like we may have another week of Josh Johnson at quarterback in Washington, which gives Deebo the chance for another decent game against a Philadelphia secondary who could be resting players. At number 27, we have Ricky Pearsall, and Pearsall showed up in a big way that helped the Niners beat Chicago last week. He's averaged over 16 yards per catch his last 2 games, and they'll look to utilize him once again this week against Seattle, who he had 108 yards against in Week 1. At number 28, we've got Brian Thomas Jr., and it's crazy to see that BTJ has only had 3 games all year long with more than 75 yards receiving. After this week, he should be close to 100 targets on the season, but he just hasn't been able to bring them in more consistently. At number 29, we have DJ Moore, and he killed a lot of fantasy owners last week with the late news that came out that he was dealing with an illness. Now we have the potential that he's rested some, if not the entire game in Week 18, which makes him highly volatile once again. At number 30, we have Troy Franklin, and this is a perfect situation of one team wanting to win against a team that will be resting starters. With the increase in targets going the way of Courtland Sutton, it just makes Franklin a little bit riskier in that Denver passing game. At number 31, we've got Jalen McMillan, and McMillan exploded in Week 17 with 114 yards on 9 targets. It was the complete opposite of what he did the week prior against Carolina. He is a little bit big play dependent, but that also means that one big play can give him a decent floor. At number 32, we have Cooper Kupp, and Kupp hasn't done much this season, but in a game for the division and number 1 seed against a 49ers defense that can't stop the pass right now, it gives him some flex potential. At number 33, we've got Christian Kirk, and Kirk hasn't filled up the stat sheet at all. He only had 1 yard last week, but he was tied for the lead in targets and now faces Indianapolis, who hasn't been able to stop slot wide receivers for weeks. At number 34, we have Marquez Valdes-Scantling, and Pittsburgh will be without another pass-catching option in Darnell Washington. He also had 9 targets last week, so it's clear that Rodgers looks his way. At number 35, we have Darius Slayton, and here we're just hoping for one big play in a great matchup against the Cowboys defense, who hasn't been able to stop the pass all season long. And then rounding out the top 36, we have Chimere DK, and dude has been a big play guy in this offense who is super boomer bust, but in a game that they will be trailing to the Jags, I'm sure that Ward will be chucking it down the field. All right, so there's your top 36 wide receivers in tier 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we've got a couple of guys on the outside looking in, and that's Emeka Egbuka, Alec Pierce, Michael Pittman Jr., Jalen Coker, Christian Watson, and Khalil Shakir. And come on, man, that's week 18, and that is the 2025 fantasy football season for our rankings, and there's all your positions for this week. And guys, that's it. The final rankings of the 2025 season, and I hope you won a championship. I hope you took home the title belt. I hope you dominated your league, and if you didn't, I hope you had a ton of fun with us this year. And listen, before we get out of here, I just want to be able to say thank you. Thank you so much for watching, for being part of Headliners Nation, for inviting me into your tribe. This has been so much fun, really a highlight of my career to be able to join you guys this year. This community is what makes Fantasy Headliners so special, and so many of you genuinely welcomed me all season. You were so kind in the comments, and I'm grateful for you to be along for the ride. And so whether you won a title or you finished last or you're just out here because you love football, we appreciate you so much for being part of the ride. And it's that support, it's the feedback, the laughs. Listen to me, it doesn't go unnoticed. And we're going to be back before you know it with off-season content, draft prep, and another season to chase the title once again. And so from me to you, from all of us here at Fantasy Headliner Nation, we just want to say Happy New Year to you, and let's go get a W.
Analytics, off the chain, all the channels, not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.